environmental history in general, that relationship is now being more directly focused in the urban area to the relationship between humans and cities itself. And I would say as a field of study, it is still somewhat primitive. Beginning in the late or mid-1980s, a lot of the focus has been really internalized, looking at the internal development of cities, and to some degree trying to draw a distinction between the built and natural environments, which, as I'll mention later, I find somewhat artificial. It tends to limit the kinds of questions you might want to ask. A lot of the research has been case study driven, although I think in recent years there's a tendency to try to get a little more global. And I do know that my own research, as an example, I began as a U.S. historian, but I tried to devote a good deal of my time, maybe half of my time, outside the country, working with colleagues in various parts of the world, in Europe and China, and Australia, and the Middle East, and trying to look at kind of common threads that exist in our history and distinctive threads, which began to raise a number of questions that might be useful in defining the urban environment. The literature results still tend to be somewhat descriptive, and I think that where this field can develop in greater vitality is drawing upon theory from a number of different other fields. I'm not going to go through those in any painful detail, but I think looking at ecological theory and systems theory, path dependence, theoretical models that grew out of other disciplines, has been kind of very, very useful in trying to make some sense of the nature of the urban environment. Looking at some of my own work, I was particularly drawn to the study of sanitation technologies, technology of sanitation, water, wastewater, and solid waste. I really kind of began my interest in the urban environment as a garbage historian, and I tried to escape from that definition for years and years. I thought it was kind of embarrassing for my parents and my wife to think that their son had spent so many years in college just studying trash. But I became prouder about that later on when I realized that a fundamental issue that touched everyone and was worthy of attention. But I went on to do some work looking at a comparison between water supplies, wastewater, and solid waste systems in the United States, not simply to track the development of these areas or even to look at the management styles, but to ask the basic question of how are these technologies, how are these services developed and toward what end? And I began to see a parallel between kind of prevailing environmental and public health views at a particular moment and the nature of the technologies themselves. For example, water supply systems in the United States became most typical in American cities about 1830, in that decade. The first major urban system was in Philadelphia in 1801. And if you look at these systems top down, if you're in an airplane or on a tall building looking down on a water system of a city in the 1830s, what you're likely to see is essentially pipes leading from a source, a river, lake, subsurface, or even groundwater, to a pumping station and distributed out in a network to houses and to various other buildings. And that tells us a lot of things. One thing it tells us is that essentially in those years, water systems were nothing more than transportation networks and move water from one place to the other. And the other thing is that at the time when these systems were developed, we had no clear idea of what caused disease. So we were kind of trapped in a period where we viewed disease as growing out of miasmas and smells and kind of non-contagious elements in society that demanded that when we thought a water supply was tainted, and the only way we could tell was if it smelled bad, looked bad, or tasted bad, then we had to find a new one. And if we assumed that this water was pure, quotes around it, then we would tap it. But in reality, we really didn't understand how water might become tainted and therefore not available for use. But nonetheless, we use these kind of sensory perceptions to design our systems. And I wrote an article about this one time I called it How Bad Science Led to Good Technology. that ultimately by moving relatively clean water from a distant source and removing waste via sewage pipe outward, it did have a positive effect upon our health. But in reality, we did it in a time we didn't understand how those things function. So in reality, when we look at a modern water system today, they are simply a modification of a very primitive approach for delivering water. In more recent years, when we understood the relationship between bacteriology and disease, certainly a time after 1880, but probably closer to the 20th century, we began to appreciate the ways in which we could indeed protect our environment by utilizing chemicals in some cases or techniques that would mitigate against bacteriological formation. And so when we look at the United States in the early 20th century, what we see are elaborated systems of technology in sanitation that reflect the need to treat and protect and filter water, for example. And so the modernizing of these systems in the 20th century, I think, is very, very much due to a transformative view of our environment, our understanding of public health at that time. And as we move closer to the present, let's say period after 1945 or so, what we see is that ecological theory, views of the world that are more holistic, tended to dictate the way in which these technologies are formed. So I was very interested in trying to make a cross comparison between different environmental perspectives and the kinds of technologies we use. This information, although historically interesting, was also, I think, significant from a policy perspective, because one of the things that I was interested in looking at the more recent so-called crises in infrastructure is the difficulty in coming forth with choices in order to deal with that crisis. In the case of developing new sources of water or also providing new sewer systems, you're faced with the problem of taking out of the ground substantially expensive and resistant technologies and replacing it with something else. That something else becomes a little bit more difficult to determine. And so when we think about modern choices in improvement of sanitation, we're having to think about things that are not only very costly, but also very complex to deal with from an engineering point of view. So path dependence theory that economists have used at various points to deal with old-style kind of market views of the economy. Path dependence theory suggests that decisions made in an early stage of a path are very hard to change later on. And indeed, when I talk to engineers about modern water systems and so forth, I talk about modularity and talk about using systems that are not dependent upon kind of permanent structures. Modern engineers understand those ideas and will feedback to me the need to think about future systems in very different ways. And this is an example of the value of history as a way of kind of raising questions about current problems. I just have a few slides give a visual impression of early methods of water gathering that are tied to individual action. On the left, you see a water merchant in Chicago taking water from the Chicago River and selling it to those that could afford it. And this kind of indicates the value of water as a commodity very early in our history, and also that it was kind of very class dependent to get your water in this way. Where you see the women on the right are actually going to the source and getting it themselves. And it is very interesting that these are women and not men that are doing that work, which is another story entirely. This is an old picture of the Thermal Water Works in Philadelphia, which was kind of the first modern water system in the United States. And these are examples of late 19th century waterworks of various kinds. And the gigantic impact of these infrastructures on cities' design and development becomes evident. And the poster I particularly like about the ways in which city services were meant to come